Stephen Poloz is the former governor of the Bank of Canada. He now serves as a special advisor at Osler Law Firm, and he's with me live in studio. Hi, nice to see you.
Pleasure.
I appreciate you making the time. Yeah. I wanted to start off, I think, with what's on a lot of Canadians' minds, which is, yes, we escaped this the application of these tariffs for seemingly 30 days, but the threat has not dissipated entirely. Yeah. If they were to be applied in the manner that Trump had threatened, I obviously understand it depends on the duration of the application, but in general, how bad would it be for the economy?
Pretty bad. You know, we could probably do no better than those numbers the Bank of Canada circulated in their analysis, but others have done similar analyses, and they sort of cluster in around 5% pay cut for the economy as a whole. It's pretty significant stuff. It takes 2 years for it to reach that point, but I think the important thing to take away from that is it's permanent. It kind of sounds like the economy slows down for a couple of years. It can, but you never make up the 5% that you lost, and so that would be a permanent loss in our living standards compared to before. Part of that is retaliation, so if you don't retaliate, the number would be smaller. And that's one of the odd things. It's almost true of any war. If you don't retaliate, you can reduce your losses, perhaps. But I think it's clear we would retaliate, and I think for our own kind of sense of pride and principle, that's what's going to happen. So we have to think about it like that, and then imagine that's how much money's on the table, 5% of your income for everybody. Exporters would bear the brunt unless the exchange rate moves a lot. If the exchange rate moves a lot, it'll kind of buffer it for exporters. It'll also buffer it for U.S. consumers if the exchange rate does its job to absorb the shock. But what it does then is it spreads the effect over the entire Canadian population.
And does it actually fully buffer the impact of the tariffs, or is it only a mitigating factor to a certain degree?
No, it just determines where it lands. So if you just had straight mechanics, the tariff only affects Canadian exporters and U.S. importers of the same good. But when it becomes a general, all mixed up, some depreciation, so on, it goes everywhere. But if the depreciation is big enough, you can imagine you're selling something down there, and the price kind of gets adjusted by the tariff and the depreciation, so not much happens. So the exporter could be protected. If that's the case, really what happens is it's the depreciation that reduces your spending power, my spending power, everybody's spending power, and that's where the 5% would come from.
The political rhetoric right now is very much, if there is a trade war, both countries end up hurting. And in particular, right, you know, if there are tariffs that the U.S. government or taxes applies to our imports going there, or our exports rather going there, then consumers there will bear the brunt of them. When you look at the potential economic impact in the U.S. versus or relative to Canada, how would you describe it?
So we know that a shock of this sort is always stagflationary. It slows both economies and raises prices in both economies. But the relative kind of depends, especially about the exchange rate move, which kind of drives a wedge between those two. And so, in general, stagflationary, and I guess given that Canada starts in a relatively weaker position, whereas the U.S. economy is quite strong, it would be more stag and less inflation for us, and less stag and more inflation for the U.S. That's probably the way I would see it happening, but of course, we honestly don't know.
Gotcha. In the middle of all of this, all of a sudden this week, it became a discussion around what we do became very focused on how do we aim to insulate ourselves from the vulnerability that we're experiencing right now. And a lot of things that you've spoken about before are now all of a sudden at the forefront of what the political class and Canadians, I would argue, regular Canadians who often reach out to me are talking about. Why are we so dependent on this one place? Can we send, for example, oil and gas to other places? And how come we have so many barriers just between ourselves? Let me start on the last part.
Right.
If we were to get rid of those barriers, and I don't purport to say it's a simple thing, but if we were, how much of an impact could that have?
The estimates that we have available suggest it's bigger than what I just described as the impact from the tariffs. That we would enjoy a permanent increase in our pay, everybody, by somewhere between 4 and 7%. The other way to look at it is it's as if there's a roughly 20 to 22% tariff within Canada So it's not that different from the 25% tariff between Canada and the United States, which is what's under threat. So it's a very significant thing, and I've said for years that that's real money. It's as if it's lying on the sidewalk and everyone refuses just to bend over to pick it up. It requires that you agree that maybe you only have one standard for transport trucks across the entire country, or you just recognize one another's standards. You don't have to change everything. You just have one piece of paper that says, what if these are the qualifications to be a carpenter in Ontario? They're a little different, let's say, in Quebec, but we recognize each other's qualifications. Those are all good qualifications, and so we don't have to rewrite everything if we cross-acknowledge or cross-recognize those things. Just labor mobility alone is probably the most important one to fix, and that's probably the easiest because a stroke of a pen could do that.
So that means having the ability to, be a nurse in a different province.
That's it. Yeah, not have to requalify, or if a couple, one of the member of the couple gets a job offer, somewhere, and wow, that's going to really be great. The spouse may have to requalify for their job. It may not take long, but it costs money and it takes time, and why, So, and there are lots of other things. Well, of course, the liquor and beer and all that, we know that's traditional. But I think this is the biggest irony ever, in the sense that Canada was formed through Confederation after a trade threat from the United States. And actually, the U.S. abrogated its free trade agreement with the Canadian provinces. The response was to create Confederation, so we would have a free trade zone, east and west, to offset our dependence on the U.S. market. Anyway, how we got here.
Full circle moment, I guess, right?
It's exactly. It's the oddest thing.
Okay, I'll leave it on that note. Mr. Poloz, pleasure as always. Appreciate your analysis.
Pleasure. Thanks.